Okay. We have a mic for me. This is my mic. All right. I want to start out, and this is interesting. I was recently in Australia with Clark, and every place that we stayed, and every time we flew from one area to the next, there was a recognition of the traditional owners. Unlike here, where it's sort of unusual. Honestly, we would land in a new place, Darwin, and the flight attendant would announce who the traditional owner of that area was. So you learn when you travel. And I am going to read our short version of Trinity's land acknowledgement. We are on Dakota and Anishinaabe Ojibwe land. We give thanks for their presence here since time immemorial and honor all our indigenous siblings who have and continue to call this land their home. And then I'd like to introduce briefly Brenda Blackhawk. Now she's back for the second Sunday, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you. And I understand her introduction was a bit abbreviated last Sunday. So let me just point out that she is many, many things. She's a member of the Ho-Chunk community. She is a sister, an auntie, a writer, a volunteer, an educator, an organizer. I thought it was rather amazing that she is the youngest of 9 siblings, or the oldest of 9 siblings, right? Yeah, so that's a lot of responsibility to have to model for the following 8. She currently works at Central Lutheran Church. She's the director of communications there, but she also is very engaged in ELC's work on truth and reconciliation, and in particular, she sits on the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force, which is what she spoke about last week, and she co-chairs the sub-task force of the ELCA on missing and murdered Indigenous women that was referenced today in our sermon. So she's eminently qualified, in other words. And with that, I will turn it over to Brenda Blackhawk.
Thank you. I got it. We're good. All right. Everybody can hear me? Okay. Good morning. Greetings to all of you, my relatives. I am Brenda Blackhawk, or I'm sorry, my name is Chachsepskainga, which means White Eagle Woman in Ho-Chunk. That's my Ho-Chunk name. But I'm Brenda. You can all call me Brenda Blackhawk. A lot of you are familiar faces from last week, so I'm really glad to see you back again. For folks who are new, I will just warn you in advance that my style of presentation is very low-key and conversational. It's not going to be very extra professional. If you have questions or concerns or thoughts or whatever that you want to share, please just raise your hand at any point and we can make some space for that. Yes, thank you for the great introduction, Claudia. I'm really glad and honored to be here again and today to talk about specifically an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is the issue of MMIW, or missing and murdered Indigenous women. A lot of people will also say MMIWG, which is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or relatives. They'll put R on the end, relatives, because across the board, regardless of age or gender expression, Indigenous people experience violence at a higher rate than everybody else. But honoring the work of Indigenous women for for more than a century now probably, in the work that they've been doing around this issue, I like to stick with MMIW. I think it's very straightforward and it honors that work that's been done. So I'm going to take some time today to talk about the issue of MMIW, why it exists a little bit, which is a little bit of theory, but some stuff is pretty true. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can respond, and specifically how the ELCA is responding in the work that I'm doing as one of the chairs of the task force. And yeah, and we'll see if it resonates with your community here, if there's some way that y'all want to plug into that work. So you'll see that this says Justice Nichols and Brenda Blackhawk because this is me and Justice usually do this presentation together. She's my co-chair. She's Cherokee, and she lives down in Oklahoma, so she is not here. So, but she's here in spirit. So the first thing we have to talk about is we need to understand the crisis a little bit. So first of all, there's a historical precedence for this. When we talk about MMIW, often we talk about the very first missing and murdered Indigenous girl. And her name was Matoaka. Many people know her as Pocahontas. And she was only 15 or 16 years old when she was kidnapped by English colonists and taken to Europe. So we often talk about her in that way as kind of being the first. So from the very beginning of interactions in North America between indigenous peoples and colonizers, this is how it's been. I like to start a little bit with a quote too from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They do a really good job of kind of summarizing this and why it's so painful. So they say, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is not new. It is more than an epidemic. Instead, it is part of the spectrum of violence experienced by Native women. This crisis of MMIW has deep roots in colonization and genocide and can be attributed to the lack of legal protections as a result of the systematic erosion of tribal sovereignty, stretching back more than 500 years. So they kind of name a couple of ways in which that there's root causes for why this happens to Indigenous women. Those of you who were here last week, you'll be familiar with this image up there. We talked about this a little bit. It's called, I don't remember what it's called now. It's in my notes for my other presentation. I think it's called American Progress by John Gast. I was going to say John Task, but John Gast, yeah. And this is an important aspect of that, which was kind of stated here in this quote from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, right, is that this idea of conquering and taking is very much rooted in the culture of colonization, and then that is one of the key causes for how Indigenous women can be seen as non-human and can be taken in that way. Okay, so Indigenous women are very disproportionately represented in the experience of violence against them. So more than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women have experienced violence in their lifetime, which is far greater than the national average. That means that there's 1.5 million Indigenous women out there who have experienced violence. So Indigenous women are 2.5 times as likely to experience violent crimes and 2 times more likely to experience rape or sexual assault crimes. Homicide is the number 3 leading cause of death for Indigenous women ages 10 to 24 years old. And it's the number 5 leading cause of death for Indigenous women 25 to 34 years old. And 40% of victims of sex trafficking are identified as Indigenous women. Let's see. And then we ask the question, who are the perpetrators? Generally, when we talk about sexual violence, most of the time when it's committed against women, it's committed within racial groups. So if a black woman is assaulted, it's usually by a black man. If a white woman is assaulted, it's usually by a white man. That is not the case for Native women. Unlike other racial groups, violence against Indigenous women is more likely to be perpetrated by someone outside. The vast majority, 96% of American Indian Alaska Native female victims of sexual violence experience violence at the hands of non-Native perpetrators. 21% have experienced interracial violence in addition to that. So why is that? And I think that's a question I think we still grapple with, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that, or maybe we won't. So there's lots of reasons for that, right? So we talked a little bit about the dehumanization of Indigenous women, right? So they're already not considered to be human in so many ways, and so there's that sense of morality as far as violence toward them is non-existent for a lot of people. There's also, again, that colonizer mindset of taking what you want and not having to face consequences of that. And then there's also the fetishization and romanticizing of Indigenous women, right? Indigenous women, I personally hate this time of year because Halloween is coming, and that means I'm going to have to deal with all the people who think it's okay to dress up as Native people as if it's a costume, which it's not. And one of the most offensive ones is the Pocahontas costume, which probably many of you have seen pictures of and images of online. But that just contributes to that sexualization of Indigenous women and dehumanization as well. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more as far as how this relates to like climate justice, which is kind of, it seems like it's a far reach, but it's actually related. And one of the things that we note too is that on tribal lands, you can get away with a lot more if you're not a tribal citizen, right? So the tribes, while they supposedly have sovereignty over their lands, they cannot like process those kinds of crimes. So oftentimes when colonizers come onto our tribal lands, they can commit these crimes and then leave and not face any repercussions. And that's kind of been the precedent. So it makes them also more easy to be victimized. Let's see. There's also a lack of law enforcement support. So oftentimes, so this graph here is showing how many, this was 2020, how many cases of MMIW there are, and how many of them were actually reported to the database, the missing persons database. You can see is only the 690. So of all the cases of MMIW, only 690 of them in 2020 were reported to the database, the national database. And a lot of the reasons for that is, again, that dehumanization of Indigenous women, but also a lot of times the way that those Indigenous women are portrayed is often as potential runaways or potentially they're drug addicts or they're not people deserving of that kind of attention. Which brings us to lack of media coverage. So in the Urban Indian Health Institute's 2016 study, so it's a little bit dated, but more than 95% of the MMIW cases in that study were never covered by national or international media. And in the same study, 31% of those media outlets who did cover them used violent language to describe the victims. Or they would maybe show a mugshot picture of them instead of, one that their family had. It was not something that would have really prompted people to really want to help and to care about this loved one who had gone missing. Okay, so Justice did some really great research on specifically how missing and murdered Indigenous women is connected to climate justice, which again seems like this, they don't seem like they go together, but they go together much more strongly than you might imagine. It's complex and rooted both in environmental and social justice. Climate justice and environmental degradation affect Indigenous communities, and the vulnerability intersects with the ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women. So the first is environmental displacement. So climate change in general is causing displacement of Indigenous people from their communities and their ancestral lands. And Indigenous people generally, we have deep, deep connections to specific places that hold story, that hold tradition, that hold medicine. And we have a lot of connections to those specific places, and due to climate change, a lot of the time we're separated from that. And that increases a vulnerability of violence, particularly for Indigenous women and girls. They're uprooted and forced into unfamiliar or precarious living situations. They often experience a lack of protection. They experience a lack of economic resources and access to justice. And in some cases, the loss to their homes or access to land can also lead to greater reliance on unstable economic systems, increasing the risk of exploitation and violence. Also, exploitation and resource extraction. To me, this is the big one. So Indigenous women, particularly in regions rich in natural resources, often bear the burden of environmental degradation caused by mining, logging, and oil extraction projects. So many of them, which occur without consent of Indigenous communities, exacerbate both environmental and social harms. If anyone's ever seen the movie Wind River, that's a good example of how we're thinking about this. If you've ever read any of Marcy Rendon's books, Where They Last Saw Her, is the one I recently read, which explains this exactly in the same sense, right? So that, which takes place in northern Minnesota, where there's people pipelining, I think, up there, and they just create basically sex trafficking rings, and they use Indigenous women in that way. So resource extraction can attract an influx of outsiders to Indigenous territories, and that's been directly linked to higher rates of violence against Indigenous women. Transient workers in these areas can commit crimes, including sexual violence, with little accountability, exacerbating the MMIW crisis. Can also talk about increased marginalization. This graphic just shows kind of how the different sections, or the intersectionality of how Indigenous women identify, right, within these systems, and how they're at the heart of these oppressive systems. And climate and environmental degradation contributes to that, especially when we talk about tribal sovereignty. So it adds to that already marginalized identity and puts them at higher risks because of it. And of course, cultural and community disintegration. Like I mentioned before, there's so many ties for Indigenous people directly to specific place. And when we are disconnected from those cultural practices, when we're disconnected from the traditional knowledge, it's harmful for the entire community. It makes us weaker when we're not able to be united and strong in that way. And again, makes us easier to become victims. So we talk about MMIW. We've kind of walked through the crisis. And before we get deeper into the rest of this, I want to take a moment and stop and ask if anybody has questions or thoughts they want to share at this moment about what you've just learned when it comes to, yes, should we get the microphone? Yep. Yes, okay, great, you're on it.
Thank you. Explain to me how law enforcement coordinates on sovereign land and how that works. Do they have their own law enforcement, or they have contract with the counties, or I'm curious why those laws aren't enforced.
Right, so the tribal police, most reservations and such have tribal police, and they do enforce the laws to the best of their ability. It's all about the prosecution and how prosecution they can't prosecute to a degree. I'm not an expert in Indian law, but I've seen, maybe somebody else is an expert in Indian law over there.
So basically the way it works is federal jurisdiction applies. If I go on a reservation, I'm a white person, I commit a crime, it's turned over to the federal prosecutors, and that's the relationship. It's not the tribal people that handle it.
Exactly. So the tribe can't prosecute, which means, yeah, it's just not exactly justice, for sure. And I would also say that while I think we often think about this issue as being in tribal communities, it's happening a lot in urban centers as well, where Indigenous people are living in places like Minneapolis and Duluth, and they're in more urban centers, but they're disappearing as well. For cases of MMIW, I'm sure there is. I don't have that. But that's a really good one. Actually, let me write that down as a stat I need to add. But I do know that about 70% of Indigenous people don't live on reservations. We live in urban centers. And in cases where MMIW happens in those urban centers, we don't see, the most I ever see for MMIW is a Facebook poster that I share on my Facebook page. I never hear about it on the news, which, to be fair, I don't really watch the news. But I don't see it anywhere when Indigenous women are going missing, and I know they're going missing in our cities and our communities. So, and part of that has to do with policing as well.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a story, and I hadn't thought about it for years, but when I was in the Air Force over in Rapid City, I remember a story that they were talking about. The sex trade was going on with a lot of different people. And they had a story on the front page of the local paper about this blonde girl that had disappeared. And in the story, but 2/3 of the way down, they had one sentence and said, we also have, and they named this girl from the reservation, had disappeared. And the story was about the blonde girl, but they mentioned, by the way, this native girl would also disappear.
Yep. And
so the press just doesn't do it.
Yep, the press doesn't do it. They really don't. If anybody's ever watched the TV show Alaska Daily, highly recommend that. It's only one season, but it's focused on specifically reporting and media in Native Alaska, in the Native community up there. And what's her face from $1 Million Baby? She's a fantastic actress. She's the main character. Hilary Swank. She's one of the main characters, but it's a lot of Native characters as well. It's a very good show. Highly recommend if you're interested in MMIW to watch that show. Any other things before we move to the next section here? Yes.
I don't remember if it was in one of Reardon's books, because she's phenomenal and I've read all of them. But I've heard that the Twin Ports is one of the biggest places where they smuggle women out.
Yep.
Because they're getting them from the Dakotas and all over Minnesota, and they get them to the Twin Ports, and they're on ships and they're gone.
Yep, absolutely.
That it's one of the biggest. Yeah.
Yep. Duluth area. Yep. Yep. Okay. So, now that we have all that horrible, depressing fact, let's talk about it a little bit as a movement. So, there is a movement, and there has been for a really long time for MMIW. I would say in the last 5 years, it's really exploded even more, which is great. You'll often see the red hand symbol, which I love the artwork here that you guys have up. That's fantastic. But the red hand, it stands for all the missing sisters whose voices are not heard. And it stands for the silence of the media and law enforcement. And it stands for the oppression and subjugation of Native women. And now rising to say no more stolen sisters. And that's the crux of it. And the movement has grown. And part of how that movement is showing up in my life is through my work with the ELCA and the MMIW task force specifically. We talked quite a bit last week about the declaration from the ELCA to American Indian and Alaska Native people. Pulled out a couple things here that are quotes from that really are talking about MMIW specifically. So we confess that we must continue to learn more about our complicity and the roles of our church played in dehumanizing Indigenous people, especially as it relates to the forced assimilation and then a bunch of stuff, and including missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and relatives. And then also the pledge part, which is we commit to consistently communicating American Indian and Alaska Native concerns across the church and to respond to those concerns accordingly. And we will begin celebrating holidays and anniversaries associated with Indigenous people appropriately. So that includes May 5th, which is MMIW Remembrance Day. So on that day, please be sure you're wearing your red shirts, take your selfies, take group pictures, whatever, and make sure you're posting online, because the more people that we can get talking about this, the more we can help limit its occurrence. So Then we get to talking about the sub-task force that I am currently co-chair of. We're doing some really great work. First of all, I just want to say that this last year at Churchwide Assembly, which happened in July, we did pass a really great resolution for MMIW, or I'm sorry, it's a memorial if it's at Churchwide, a memorial. Yeah, so it's gonna help us do our work. It's just kind of giving us a little bit more support for the ELCA and reasons for the ELCA to want to communicate what we're talking about and share that stuff out for more people. But the sub-task force, we have a great group on the sub-task force. So it's led by me and Justice. There's a couple other Native folks on that, including Vance. But then we also have some really great representatives from different organizations. So Women of the ELCA, the director for that is on that group, as well as one of the main lead people from Lutheran Men in Mission, because this is also a very important issue for them. We have some representative from the young adults of the ELCA, and as well as some folks who write curriculums and things like that have some of that more theological background as well. So it's a really great mix of people, and we came up with 4 goals for our task force. So the first is to raise awareness, which I've talked about a little bit. So engaging with media and organizations to spread the word about MMIW and make sure people understand the issue, why it's important, and how that they can educate other people and talk with people about it. So our goal is to have a presence in ELCA spaces and promote the Day of Remembrance across the ELCA. So this coming year, we're going to have T-shirts that you can buy that support, and then you can post on social media. And then also, we're trying to find funding with some foundations to work with an Indigenous filmmaker named Solomon. He lives up in the Duluth area, and he's a professional filmmaker, and what he's done in pro bono in his free time a couple of times now is when Indigenous women go missing up there and their families reach out to him, he will make videos and basically do his own media blitz, right? This is something that everybody can share out about this person and try to get more support in helping find them. And he's been doing that unpaid here and there for a couple of years. And so one of our goals is to fund that project and have him go around the country and do some of those videos for people and share that story and create kind of a video database of these stories. So we're still looking for funding. If people have any ideas about foundations that want to give big dollar grants, let me know. We also have, as our second goal, creating educational materials. So we're working on, I mentioned a video series, we're working on a toolkit that kind of just breaks down leading up to May 5, here's activities you can do. We also talked about perhaps Lent kind of leads up to May 5 a little bit, so creating a Lenten devotional or liturgical resource that leads up to May 5 that can be kind of done leading up to that. So we have some people on that. That probably won't come out till 2027 would be my guess. And then we have connecting, which is one of the biggest goals. And the goal for connecting is really to help facilitate pathways for congregations and organizations to connect with local Indigenous communities and equip them to assist in response to the MMIW instances that happen in their communities. So we're working on creating kind of like a pilot program. We're calling it the MMIW Response Network, and we're going to have a couple of congregations to start with who are going to be trained by us and other leaders who know what to do in the issue. They're going to make a strategy plan that is consistent with their particular context in the communities that they're near. And we're going to help facilitate for them relationship with those tribal communities, and in that relationship be able to respond however is appropriate to instances of MMIW that come up in their area. So that might look like congregations helping put posters up. It might look like congregations calling their local media and demanding that they cover the story, because a lot of times our voices in church spaces like this are more easily heard by media than Indigenous communities. It could look like not Indigenous people, but congregation members getting trained to say they live in a more rural area and they need to do a search, and maybe they get trained to help lead a search or help be a part of a search or support a search, whatever that looks like. So again, very specific to their context, and they would develop their own plan to respond. And then they would be ready and good allies for instances of MMIW that happen in their area. So we're really excited about this possibility. It's a really tangible way for churches and the ELCA to show up. So we're excited about this, and it's still in pretty early development phase. Hopefully this time next year we'll maybe have our first church coming into this program and learning. But the part that makes it a network is that as more churches join into that work, then they can share resources with each other. We would build that out as part of the work so that no one church feels like they're totally alone in the work, and building that network. And then, of course, advocacy, helping to rally around key legislative items that are related to MMIW. So there's already been several things that have passed over the years. Of course, the Violence Against Women Act does mention MMIW specifically in there, and that was signed again in 2020. I don't know where that's at. It's been re-signed or whatever. I think that came up a while ago. And then Savannah's Act, which was specifically addressed, here I might have specific notes on that. Okay. So there was also the Not Invisible Act. Okay, this is the Savannah's Act, I believe. The Not Invisible Act of 2020. It created a missing and murdered unit of the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And there are currently 15 BIA offices around the country with MMIW units. And I have to caveat that with, I'm not sure if this is still accurate with the new administration, but it was when I wrote this a while ago. So, and then there was an act or a bill last year, last session, that was Senate File 465 and House 1292, and that was introduced in 2023. It was still getting some traction last year, and it specifically had some areas in there that would give funding to tribal communities to do better MMIW media and outreach, and to offer more support to their tribal police units to do that work. And then we can talk about what specifically individuals can do. Of course, educating yourself and others, learn that history, try to understand those systemic causes and current challenges faced by Indigenous communities, and familiarize yourself with the ways in which colonialism, racism, sexism, and poverty contribute to the violence experienced by Indigenous women. You can read reports, you can read studies, you can get more updated stats than the ones I have, which I need to do as well. And then, of course, sharing your knowledge as well. Use social media, community events, or informal conversations to raise awareness about MMIW. Share articles, share documentaries, and the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Today I mentioned 3 more pop culture kind of things. I mentioned a book, a TV show, and a movie that are all good resources for you to help get a different picture of this story that is MMIW. And of course, you can support Indigenous-led organizations. You can volunteer there, you can donate there, and just follow and amplify those Native voices. If you're on social media and you follow a Native organization, you can share that information. It's really easy to do. It's a really easy way to keep in the loop on that. So you could be following Indigenous activists, writers, and advocates. You can attend their events and then amplify that discussion. And of course, we're always asking for people to help advocate for legislative change, support those MMIW-related bills, lobby for increased funding. So you can always advocate for that, for increased funding for the law enforcement, victim services, and public safety initiatives that are specific for Indigenous communities, and support Indigenous sovereignty. As we talked about, Indigenous sovereignty is always a little bit under question, especially when it comes to the legal pieces. So whenever we can advocate for stronger tribal sovereignty and self-governance, that's a win for Indigenous women. Raising awareness through events and campaigns. So participate on May 5th. And the Red Dress campaign, which is something we're working on again for our toolkit this year. We're hoping that some congregations will hang red dresses, maybe in their sanctuary or maybe in their foyer when you walk into the church, with a sign that says, this is what the red dresses stand for, what they mean, and continuing help to raise awareness. There are marches that happen, so you can organize and attend marches or participate. There's vigils we have on the elca.org/indigenous. You can find a really great MMIW vigil written specifically where you're lighting candles for Indigenous women. It's a short service, but it's very impactful. We did it this last year at Central on May 5. And then you can also support individual families of MMIW, people who have lost loved ones or are missing loved ones. And if you know of a specific MMIW case, help share that story, pressure local authorities for updates, and amplify those voices in the media. Especially anything about the well-being of Indigenous women. All right, that's the end of the presentation specifically. I am gonna make room for questions. I do want to, if it's okay with everybody here, set a timer for, let's do 1 minute and 30 seconds, and let's have a moment of silence for all of the MMIW, all of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who are missing. So I'll start that now. Pinagee for taking that time. Thank you. I think it's easy sometimes for me even, to forget as I do this work and I lead these presentations. The educating part of it is so important, but I mean, I think it's easy sometimes to forget that it's real people's lives, real loved ones, sisters, daughters, mothers. So having that pause is helpful for me too. So yes, all right, questions?
Just one real quick question. You talked a lot about social media. Is there a Facebook page that we can all get on and find out all this information you've just given us? Or is there something, a group around that we can find out more?
So every area might have its own. I wish that there was something more centralized. I can say, and you know what, I should probably start adding this to my notes because this question comes up a lot. There are a few organizations, more local, that do talk about this issue more. And there's some national ones. So the first one I think of is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They are often advocating for things related to MMIW, and they will often have educational events and things like that, and so it's worth following them on social media because stuff comes up there. Native Hope is another one, if they're still operating. I think they are. And then locally, we have a Minnesota Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which is an incredible organization. I don't know if they post a lot on social media, but they're an organization that's worth following as well. Yeah, it would take a little research. You would hope that every area would have kind of their own kind of spot for that. I'm not sure of, there is something on Facebook I follow, but they're not super active. Maybe something around Native Lives Matter or something like that. Yeah, sorry. Someday I will have a really solid list for people, and it's just not today, unfortunately.
Hi there. My question is not necessarily MMIW, but it has to do with law enforcement on reservations. My brother-in-law is Hidatsu and came from Newtown, North Dakota.
Sure.
I was with him last week, and he is sharing stories that are outrageous about the presence of ICE on reservations.
Yeah.
And specifically looking for Native people to something as simple as a traffic infraction, reason to pull them over and haul them off, which is so beyond outrageous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So my question is, how can ICE have a presence on reservations? Help me understand the law enforcement structure in that scenario.
So ICE is a federal agency, so they pretty much have the right to be anywhere in the country, which is unfortunate. Yeah, and there's lots of instances, especially in the Southwest right now. I have lots of friends down in Navajo country, and Native people are getting picked up and questioned, and they're not accepting their tribal IDs as legitimate identification, which it's yeah, the original inhabitants of the land, and yeah, so there are definitely instances of them being picked up and taken into detention facilities and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah, and it's just a federal agency, so there's not much anybody can do to stop them. Yep.
Did the federal Indian schools have any impact on this particular issue, negatively or positively?
Absolutely. I think they're definitely related. The idea of taking people and children and girls is very related to the ways in which the federal government gave the A-OK to do that to Indigenous children and move them into boarding schools, right? I mean, it's a very clear correlation. But it also, that goes back to then the strength of community, right? So one of the reasons that Indigenous communities are often easily targeted for this kind of thing is that it's a lot harder for those communities to be really strong and unified because their children were taken, their culture was taken, pretty much everything was taken. And so it's a lot harder to have the kind of strength in that way, right? We say we're resilient people, and we are. We're still here, but so much has been taken, so much has been lost. I actually don't like the word lost because it implies that we set it down somewhere, which isn't what happened, right? It was taken. So in Indian boarding schools were one of the key ways that was done. It was a cultural genocide where so much of our identities and how we experience the world and practice the world and how we live in community with each other was taken away. There's so many stories. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I highly recommend Sandy Whitehawk's book. She's a local author and a good friend, and she's an advocate for Native children and families, but she was one of the kids who were taken and then adopted out and was raised by a white family, and her story of reconciliation with her tribe, because if you grow up and live in a tribal community and then someone comes and they're saying, well, I'm Native, my family, I was taken, but they don't know any of the tribal customs, they don't know any of the cultural practices, they don't know how to be in those spaces, it's very hard. And so Sandy talks a lot about that in her book, but it's another piece of it, right? So yeah, anyways, yes, I think that there's a direct correlation for sure in many, many ways. Not to mention that the trauma from those schools has deeply, deeply affected Indigenous people in ways that show up not well, right? There, we do have a higher rate of drug and alcoholism and stuff like that, partially because of that trauma and trying to deal with that. That intergenerational trauma is very real, but also when you're in those situations, you become an easier victim, right? So, yes, to answer your question the long way.
I just think, I just wanted to make sure that people knew that in Minnesota, we're very lucky that there are Native American female lawmakers here in Minnesota. So Representative Heather Keeler out of Moorhead, Senator Mary Kunish out of New Brighton, they passed a bill in 2023, and now the office is up. So in the Office of the Department of Public Safety, in the Office of Justice Programs, there is an MMIR program there with an executive director who are working on a lot of stuff. So you can always go to the Department of Public Safety here in Minnesota and see the work that they are doing. And obviously our Lieutenant Governor, who's running for U.S. Senate, is very active in that. So
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for naming that. I got to add that to my presentation too. Normally I do this presentation on Zoom and it's from people across the country, so we don't always get state specific, but I should put that in here.
This is more just information for the group as a whole. So you mentioned about at the churchwide assembly this year, some of the work that was done related to this. The ELCA also this year at the churchwide assembly put forward some work that had started in 2019. A task force put together a document related to gender justice. And it's filled with both action items, history, but also stories. And Kelly Sherman Conroy, who some of us maybe have met or have heard her speak, shares a story in there about how she was at a churchwide assembly worship service and was providing communion to people. And she had chosen to paint the hand over her mouth. And what she experienced was that people started stepping out of her line to receive the bread and the wine. And actually, she heard little comments about it was inappropriate, and right up to the end, people were avoiding her rather than being curious because they didn't know, or somehow they felt like that wasn't the place to recognize and honor. So thank you for asking all of us to stop our thinking and remember, because if we don't and we just move through the motions, we're not going to change any of this. So thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So on the racial justice ministry team, we have this conversation a lot about how do we advocate, how do we participate, how do we get to know. So oftentimes, those of us with our white skin will go in and we mess it up because we think we have an answer. And you had mentioned, one thing of, volunteer. And so there's this hesitation of, is that stepping into a space that we don't belong? Or if we do come to that, what's appropriate?
Yeah.
How do we do it right, since we've done it wrong for so long?
Yep.
And that uncertainty, I think, can be somewhat stops us from maybe stepping into that space.
Yep.
Could you talk to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great question and fully understandable. So the biggest thing that causes problems when white folks enter those kinds of spaces is that they already think that they know what's best and how they can fix it. And they jump in and they say, I'm going to fix this with this. Sometimes they want to throw money at things. Sometimes they want to, they have this idea in their head, and so that's what they're going to do regardless of what anybody else says. And the biggest, most important thing is to show up and listen. Because when you have a relationship with people, hopefully you all experience this in your lives, you have a relationship with somebody, it's not always telling them something, it's always listening as well, right? And it's the same thing. So you go into those spaces open to listening and to not believing you already know what's best and what the right way is, and you just do what's asked instead of trying to solve the problem. Just be there supporting the people who are working to solve the problem. And sometimes that means that you will have an opinion and you will tell somebody and they will either say that's a great idea or a bad idea, but it's never conditional. I think that's another thing too. I've seen over the years and heard stories of over the years where white folks will have this great idea, they'll bring it and they'll say, we want to do this thing, and the Native people will be like, no, that's not what we're thinking. And they'll go out and do it anyways, right? So I think it's okay. I think if there's a space where you can volunteer, where you're invited into that, do it. You're invited, that means you're there. I get a lot similar question about powwows. Well, I'm afraid to go to powwow. I don't want to come in on a ceremonial moment or something like that. No, if you hear about a powwow, you're invited to that powwow. All of our secret ceremonies, we don't invite nobody to. So it's if you see an invitation to a powwow, you're welcome there, and go and experience it. But it's the same kind of thing. If you're invited to volunteer, go do it. Just go ready to listen and follow instruction versus being the leader in that space, because you're not.
Related to powwows, I was interested in going to the one in Shakopee, and I looked on the website. They have a page for visitors. Please come to the powwow. Here's what you need to know.
Yeah.
Like it was very clear they wanted people to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We love to show off that part of our culture, for sure. Anything else? I know y'all have church starting again in a couple minutes, so.
Yeah, if some of you are going to second service, please feel free to get up and go. We understand, and we are not going to mark you down as, oh my gosh. Any other questions, or otherwise we can wrap it up here, and Brenda will be here for a bit. But Brenda, it has just been a joy and pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.